Thank you very much, and good morning. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss migrants as one of the key populations. These are my disclosures. I will be addressing this topic following these 4 bullet points. I'll briefly mention the importance of acknowledging the heterogeneity of migrant populations. In fact, they're so heterogeneous that they lead to different HIV epidemics within the different migrant groups in Europe. I'll briefly discuss factors driving post-migration acquisition of HIV, and will close by addressing the structural barriers to access both HIV testing and treatment for HIV and for other STIs. Migrants are very heterogeneous populations, really impossible to describe. They represent different groups of persons with very different migration drivers. And these migration drivers condition the distinct context for HIV and for STIs infections. Migrants have multiple layers of vulnerability. They are multi-level layers, as many of my other colleagues in the table have addressed when talking about their, the key populations. It's not only that they have certain individual characteristics, they're younger populations, therefore they have higher prevalences of STI infections, or they come from countries of origin where certain STIs are more prevalent or have different health-seeking behaviors that will make them less likely to be tested or treated for STIs. But what is very, very relevant to most migrant populations across the world is the economic deprivation, which often leads in some occasions to transactional sex, and all the aspects that my colleagues in the table have also described. So all these multi-level and cross-sectional aspects that we've been discussing in this table. Social inequity and I would say here entitlement to healthcare for some migrant groups, particularly for those undocumented, is a key issue that is going to influence access to testing and care. And of course, human rights abuses. Migrants are often also exposed to homophobia, xenophobia, racism, often the different forms of discrimination altogether. And finally, this is very different for men and for women. So again, very, very complex. Not surprisingly, this leads to distinct and different epidemics. We cannot talk about the epidemics in migrants. We need to go a bit deeper than that. Worldwide, the contribution of migrants to regional epidemics varies across the world. The highest contribution, both in absolute and in relative terms, of migrant populations across the world is in Europe. 40% of all new HIV diagnoses reported to ECDC have a country of origin that is different to the country of report. This is followed by Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and Sub-Saharan Africa, where migrants from other African regions are also a very substantial proportion. I'll be concentrating largely because of my area of expertise in this part of the world. This heterogeneity of migrant population affects not only the proportion of cases that have a migrant origin, but also the geographical origin of the migrant populations. In this slide produced by colleagues from ECDC, we can see how not only 40% of migrants, of all cases reported to in Europe are migrants, but within this, though the majority originate from Sub-Saharan Africa, in the light green, there is also substantial heterogeneity in the countries of origin of other migrant groups. Look at the contribution of European migrants, migrants from other regions in Europe, and the contribution of migrants from Latin America and the Caribbean in purple. And this is also very different across countries. In Spain, where I come from, the largest proportion of migrants originate from Latin America and the Caribbean. And the epidemics in these groups really mimic epidemics in countries of origin. So the mechanism of transmission, the sex ratio are going to be, again, very heterogeneous. The fact that there are different epidemics is reflected by this ECDC slide, showing that the numbers of heterosexually transmitted HIV infections in migrants, in green, are declining. So are the numbers of migrant injecting drug users. On the contrary, the numbers of migrant men who have sex with men are increasing. Just focusing on these two groups, migrant MSM and heterosexual migrants, ECDC has quantified that the decline in the number of HIV reports in migrants infected heterosexually, and this is largely migrants coming from sub-Saharan Africa, to a lesser extent Caribbean and other European countries, but it's largely sub-Saharan African, has declined by 36%, whereas migrant men who have sex with men, largely coming from Latin America, the Caribbean, and other European countries, have gone up by 58%, distinct epidemics. And when we look further into the countries of origin of the migrants, because simplifying sub-Saharan Africa, Europe, or Latin America and the Caribbean, again, is an oversimplification, we see that the declines seen in this 36% in the number of HIV reports heterosexually infected are very different according to the region of origin within sub-Saharan Africa. In fact, the declines are driven by declines in the numbers originating from eastern sub-Saharan Africa and from central sub-Saharan Africa. When you look at the dark blue line, that's migrants coming from countries in western sub-Saharan Africa, there is no decline. In fact, it's the largest number. These are data from women, but the numbers in men are just the same. The lower numbers, but trends are similar. On the contrary, and this is work that we're presenting in this conference coming along this week, the HIV epidemics in migrants from Latin America and the Caribbean are driven by men who have sex with men. Over half of migrants coming from Latin America and the Caribbean are men who have sex with men, and this is likely to be gross underreporting. And this goes as high as 84% of all the reports of men coming from South America, when numbers are increasing. And the declines are due to those who have unknown region of origin, which is excellent news for improvement in data reporting. Consistently, men who have sex with men from all regions within Latin America and the Caribbean have higher CD4 cell counts, suggesting higher HIV testing and probably higher STI testing as well. Also, new data will be presenting in this conference the high proportion of MSM among migrants from other Western European countries. Lines in dark blue show increases in the number of reports in migrant men from other Western European countries. The majority are gay men, also showing consistently higher CD4 cell count, more testing, but more infections. So where are these migrants being infected by HIV? Well, you know that the factors underlying the high rates for HIV infections in migrants are those that drive infections in countries of origin. Therefore, our interventions, if we want to address migrant health, have to be placed in origin, in transit, and in destination. Also in transit, you have read in the news the dramatic conditions many migrant men and women go through to reach Europe, to reach the United States. They cross deserts, they drown in the sea, and they have to engage in transactional sex, which puts them at risk for HIV and for STI, but it's extremely difficult to study this very complex period of transit for migrants. And of course, for the ones that arrive to the destination, they're also going to be at risk, and the context they're going to be exposing them to various high-risk situations. To address this aspect, we conducted this study in collaboration with EATG, funded by the EU, the AMAZE study, where we conducted over 2,000 interviews in 9 European countries. The contribution of Spain was very high, and I'm pointing this out so you can interpret some of the findings that I'll be sharing with you just now. What we did is that we collected extensive data through electronic questionnaires translated to 19 languages, and we asked for information on sexual behavior, on migration trajectories, and various other aspects. So working backwards from HIV diagnosis and knowing the trajectories of CD4 cell counts and viral load over time, we were able to estimate the likely date of HIV acquisition, and because we had migration data, we could estimate whether HIV had taken place before or after migration. Of all migrants we interviewed, 68% were men, and 46% were men who have sex with men, and the median age was 36 years. The countries of origin again showed the heterogeneity I've been stressing during the presentation. Surprisingly, the proportion of migrants coming from sub-Saharan Africa is lower than you would expect when you look at the ECDC data, but this is at the expense of higher proportion of migrants coming from Latin America and the Caribbean, because we recruited more migrants from Spain. This is why I am putting this in context. So the proportion of migrants who acquired HIV after migration to Europe overall was 63% and varied according to the transmission category and region of origin. 72% of the migrant men who had sex with men, and just half of heterosexual migrants from sub-Saharan Africa acquired HIV after migration to Europe. And this is very consistent with the data from the Parcours study conducted in France, just looking at sub-Saharan Africans, where they also identified very high post-migration HIV acquisitions for migrants coming from sub-Saharan Africa. We had data from Migrant Msm, which was kind of more unique because there are less data on this group. And Migrant Msm were more likely to be single, to have stable residency status, which really grants access and entitlement to healthcare, have higher education and income, and really have a higher socioeconomic position than heterosexual migrants and migrant injecting drug users. And this puts them obviously to the less exposed to the social hardships that heterosexual migrants from sub-Saharan Africa are exposed to. This is very well described in the Parcours study in France that have more data to look at this than we did. And they've looked at the social hardships of men and women from sub-Saharan Africa, particularly looking at the women and how sex work puts them at risk for HIV and STI acquisition. Migrant MSM are exposed to other kind of issues, and in this work from EMIS, they showed how homophobia in countries of origin and anti-migrant structural stigma is associated with poorer outcomes regarding HIV, STI knowledge, and high risk of sexual behavior after migration. Finally, I'll address the structural barriers to access testing and treatment. Well, we're discussing all these barriers this morning. You're well aware that all these barriers to access testing and care for migrants are located at different locations and have different natures. They've all been mentioned before. I just want to raise the one that is unique to undocumented migrant populations, that is legal entitlement to health care, because undocumented migrants in most countries are not entitled to access health care. All these barriers, they act in synergy to limit the acceptance or the uptake of testing to STIs and treatment and responses, and they undermine any of our public health approaches to HIV and STI controls. And I want to really pay tribute again to my colleagues from ECDC who conduct this Dublin Declaration survey where they monitor responses in Europe. And this is a shame for the European countries in red that are currently not providing access to antiretroviral treatment for undocumented migrants in 2017. And we talk about universal access for ART globally, but we forget that here in Europe, all these countries in red are not providing treatment for these migrants. So when PrEP is finally implemented across Europe, I hope it will be sooner than later, and this is a map of the current situation of PrEP implementation. Will migrants and will undocumented migrants be entitled to access care? Probably not. So I just want to close with some bullet points and take-home messages that responses and strategies have to be global and inclusive in origin and in destination. It would be too optimistic to talk about transit when we see the news and we know what happens to people who are transiting to reach Western European countries. We need to increase HIV testing, but not only test, link them to care. You cannot test without treatment. Testing is not a mean, is not an end in itself, but a mean to access treatment. For PrEP, we need comprehensive STI approaches, and it's frustrating to keep saying that universal access for ART is also needed in Europe. A substantial proportion of undocumented migrants are not entitled to ART in Europe. This is all. Thank you very much.